We have lots and lots of chapter members. It's wonderful to see you all. And also lots of WNPS members from other chapters. Welcome. We're so excited that you're here. And I also see that there's lots of non-members from the Native Plant Society as well. And so that's wonderful. We're super glad to get the news out about these presentations. And just know that if you're interested and if you're not a member of the Washington Native Plant Society, and you'd like to become one, you can visit WNPS.org, and you can be a part of the Wenatchee Valley chapter if you'd like. So welcome to everybody. And just another big thank you to Denise for making this all happen, and for our speaker, Helen, for last minute being able to wrangle this presentation for us. And on that note, I would like to introduce Connie Mamel, who is the president of the Wenatchee Valley chapter. Thank you, Connie.
Well, thank you, Emily. And yeah, and I'm Connie Mamel, chair of the Wenatchee Valley chapter, and I'm really pleased to introduce my very dear former colleague, Helen Lau, tonight. Helen is a botanist for the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest, and Helen manages the rare botanical species and native plant restoration and the invasive plant program for the Cle Elum Ranger District. Helen has an undergraduate degree from Evergreen State College, and she has a master's degree in mycorrhizal ecology from Central Washington University, the Biological Sciences Department. Helen's a member of the vegetation team for the I-90 Wildlife Connectivity Project, and that's in partnership with the Washington Department of Transportation. And tonight she's going to present an overview of the native plant restoration as part of the I-90 Wildlife and Connectivity Project. Very exciting project that's going on in the state of Washington. So Helen, thanks so much for being here, and I'm really eager to hear your presentation. I think you're still muted, Helen.
Okay, thanks. I found the unmute button. Thank you, Connie. I really appreciate you guys invited me to speak. I know some of you that are listening in might have seen a presentation. It's very similar to this one I did for the Washington Botanical Symposium just 2 months ago now. And I'm pretty much presenting some very similar content that I did present at that presentation, but I did hear from people, and they said they were just interested in more details and plant lists and things like that. So I'm hoping to share a little bit more of the details of some of the work we did in the I-90 project. And I want to begin this evening by kind of giving you a little overview context of how the Forest Service views native revegetation, and sort of some of the thinking that we've gone through as restoration practitioners. You know, hopefully it can help you and just help you think about work that you might be doing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation here with you. Okay. Oops, sorry, it's very touchy. All right, I am going to try to have my chat window open if folks really have some dying questions that they would like me to, and I'm not touching on as I'm going through. So I work for the U.S. Forest Service, and I've had the pleasure of working with a whole myriad of people on the I-90 project, and it's been also part of my own learning and growing as a native plant practitioner. And it's really great to be able to utilize botanical skills and kind of understanding ecology in all of this work. So let me start out tonight by talking to you a little bit about some of the background that really drives native plant restoration in the Forest Service. So we have some guidance all the way from Washington office that really helps us think about if we're doing restoration on the landscape, you know, when it comes to fire or different kind of disasters, how we should restore land, you know, preventing invasive plants and things like that. But then the direction came out in the early 2000s that really dictated how we should do revegetation with the native plant imperial policy. And this policy really gave us some more specific guidance in using native plants, but not just native vegetation, but also native vegetation that was genetically adapted, locally genetically adapted to those locations. And this would help protect the native vegetation's genetic resources, maintaining diversity. They're also asking us to maintain genetic, we don't want to cause genetic contamination to the local populations. Also be cognizant that we could be introducing invasive species, invasive pathogens as we're using this revegetation. And then also thinking about pollinators, as we recognize pollinators are declining. I'm sorry, I'm hearing that I'm freezing a little bit. So let me know if you need me to go back a slide, and I can definitely do that. Yeah, even my stuff is a little slow. Let's see. So with that policy comes the thought process of, okay, that is really meaningful, that policy to move forward with from an ecological perspective, but how do we get there? And I think it was pretty daunting to a lot of people at first, but actually in the foresters, we've been kind of thinking about this for some time now, and already putting some of these concepts to action in our conifer program. You know, when we're thinking about this, we need to have the framework or the structure so that we can obtain native plants. And then also, how do we define what is locally adapted? What is that boundary? And how will we make that material available? And how will it be available when we need it? What will be the guidelines for how we source this material? So really, it will come down to, we need to have the right seeds at the right time and from the right place. So how you could imagine this process moving along, we may collect some plant propagules, you know, live seed, live material, process them in some way. Maybe we put them into a nursery. In terms of, for the Forest Service, we also took an extra step where, especially because we were interested in disease resistant, we may send them to a nursery for screening for disease resistance, processing, you know, some of the seeds or the seedlings that are grown from that process, possibly needing to store material, seed, frozen cuttings. And then we have two choices. We could either put those plants into a nursery production, or we can outplant them in actual plants, or just seed directly. So that's kind of the basic process that we need to consider. So like I said, you know, we've been in the Forest Service, we've been kind of thinking about this since about the late 60s. You can see in Oregon and Washington, and they had already developed laser pointer. There you go. You can see early in this late 60s, we were already developing zones, and these are mostly based on elevation and some eco-region information. And then later, through various studies and monitoring of how successful these outplantings were, we began to recognize that species such as Doug fir or Western cedar had really specific bands where you could actually move them based on their various adaptive traits. And so, you know, some of this was some of the early foundational work that really drives how we think about using native forbs and shrubs and grasses now as well. A lot of these studies were completed through this study called Genecology. So Genecology is basically studying plant adaptation. And so how these studies look, you would collect a whole bunch of different individuals of one species from a certain region. So in this case, it was in the Pacific Northwest, sort of similar ecoregions. So they took all of these collections, and then you would grow them in one common environment. So that way you just flatten the environment, and then you can really get to various adaptive traits and measure things like cold hardiness, drought tolerance, growth rate, phenology, bud break, maybe number of flowers, timing of seeding, things like that. And then you can take those adaptive traits and you can model them with the environment and really see how those different traits that are really important for seed production and pollination timing, how those are driven by various environmental variations like elevation and temperature. And actually, when we did some of this work, they figured out, I say we, this is actually the genetics group within the Forest Service and various groups working on genetic adaptability in plants. They were able to show that some characters were related to each other. For instance, we could look at elevation and lowest annual temperature. They ended up being related to each other. So we were able to use one as the other, a proxy for that to understand movement of these traits. And so many of these studies have been done probably for about the last 15 years. The slide's kind of old. I stole some of these slides from our local geneticists on in our region. And so they've done about 32 of these at that point. I don't think there's a whole lot of these going on anymore. What she told me is we are doing some long-term studies, kind of monitoring of like blue wildfire or pseudoregionary cicada, a few grasses. But you can see a large number of grasses were completed, and probably because grasses are really something we use a lot for erosion control and you know, maybe feed. And so there's a lot of different types of functions grasses play in restoration, and then a handful of trees and shrubs and forbs as well. And so this work was done by the Forest Service and also the Department of Ag and BLM sort of all collaborated on this. So this has been really great to help us understand how far you can move one species from one place to another without really causing maladaptation to those adaptive traits. But we can't do this for every species, of course. That, you know, we've done a good kind of example of many different taxa, but often we're going to be without information. And so this is something that was developed by Andy Bauer, St. Clair, and Erickson in 2014, where they took some really high resolution climate data, PRISM data out of Oregon State University, and they overlaid it with minimum winter temperature, and then an aridity index, and then the Olmert ecoregions. And Olmert ecoregions, if you're not familiar with it, is sort of a veg zoning that is based on vegetation, geology, topography, and soils. And so when you overlay all three of those, a lot of those were selected because of some of those previous Genecology studies that really showed us what were characters that were really strong drivers of why plants were where they were. So you can use these provisional seed zones, and that's kind of what we have been using in the Forest Service in these last 7 years. So here's just a closer look of the provisional seed zones. Let me orient you. Right here are the 3 lakes you have in Washington: Snoqualmie Pass, Cochise, Catchullis, Cochise, and Lake Cle Elum. And so you can see right here, there is a temperature range. And so this is the mean annual temperature, and this is how it's calculated. Mean max temperature plus minimum temperature divided by 2. And so 20-25 degrees is sort of that calculation. And you can see most of the, here's the crest right here, this red line. And the crest actually comes down and follows this blue line. You can see there's a real difference in temperature here, 15 to 20. So our temperature goes down because this is really our high elevation alpine areas. And then the second value here is the aridity. So as the number goes higher, the more dry and droughty the conditions are. So we have 20-25 here degrees on sort of the west of the crest, and then you actually get into a similar temperature range, but then you get into a lower aridity index just on the other side. So just to kind of help you look at this seed zone just in a closer view. So this information is actually available to everyone. This is the website, and so you can overlay your location with this data. You can even look at species specific, you're just interested in how some of these, like allium, cuneatum, you can look at those specifically and see how those seed zones played out. So when we generalized all the data and we looked at it across the Pacific Northwest, that gave us about 21 seed zones in Oregon, Washington, 87 within 8 seed zones, and 98% of them are within 13 seed zones. So you can kind of generalize with all that information. Of course, there's the caveat as a local revegetation specialist or botanist. You know, I recognize there are some real differences. For instance, maybe in Washington versus Oregon, but you can see there's some similarity. Where they connected the zones between the two states. So I think this is kind of a first start for how you may plan your revegetation project if you're really interested in maintaining genetics. You know, these are some characters, some things that have been using, or we're using empirical data to try to help you delineate those. But of course, there's some other local knowledge involved when you're really thinking about moving seeds and plants. Here's a good example. If you look all the way up here, this is sort of a Rocky Mountain zone coming into Washington, and you have some of the same seed zones showing up in southern Oregon on the western side. And so, you know, of course, that makes sense. You wouldn't mix those seed zones. Somebody was asking about yes, soil. So soil is considered within the ULMRIC's ecozone, and that has also been one of my caveats is soil. So for instance, where I'm located, I have the Teanaway, so I'm full of serpentine. And so the Teanaway has actually been combined with Snoqualmie Pass as one seed zone. So for me as a local practitioner, I've looked at that and said, yep, those are definitely two different seed zones. And so I keep the Teanaway out. And, you know, again, thinking about genetics, what I wouldn't want to do is bring in genetics from Snoqualmie Pass into the Teanaway and ask those plants to adapt to serpentine soils, as opposed to serpentine soil plant coming out of there, which it may have an easier time actually adapting that. So those are just some things to think about as well. It's not as clear cut as maybe the story I'm laying out, but this is kind of your first cut, and it's just a great way to start thinking about it. So as I talked about earlier, there's some structure that, you know, some facilities that had to be developed and are maintained through the Forest Service to help support all of this restoration using native plants. So it's a variety of seed facilities and nurseries. Here's one of our really one of our oldest nursery facilities that's still active, the Dorena Genetic Resource Center. So as I talked earlier in our native plant policy, we also, our policy guides that we need to prevent encroachment of non-native pathogens specifically. And so here is where a lot of seeds, especially conifers, have come in, and they have a whole disease resistance screening process. They do field validation of the planting, they've collected seed, and they actually have some small production of native seeds and native vegetation. They have a whole seed storage facility as well. And so they're sort of one aspect of our native plant nurseries that support this program. We also have a hardwood facility in Oregon, in Clarno, a propagation center. This is where we do a lot more of like clonal type growing of like willows and cottonwoods and those sort of aquatic plants. They've also been lately really working with milkweeds, growing acres of milkweed seed and looking at different phenology of different milkweeds from all over the Pacific Northwest. And actually with all of the growing out of milkweed seed, it's been really fascinating to watch that it's becoming a new stop for milkweed, rather for monarchs. And so they've been doing a lot of other work with monarchs there as well. But here they produce about 50 million cuttings for lots of different agencies. It's a really important native plant facility. One that we utilize and many other agencies utilize and others public can also use is our bend seed extractor, which you ever get a chance to tour this facility, it is amazing to see all the thousands of different screens and methods and machines that have been designed to clean and process native seed. So they, right now to this date, they can process about 2,700 different native plant seeds. Really fun to go on their website and you can see all of the different seeds. They document them in photos, and they also store, they database. They're just really our local resource for anything related to seed and storing seed. So they can be our consultants as well. And then the Forest Service has a myriad of different native plant nurseries. Ben's in Lucky Peak, Boise, Idaho. We have one in another one in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and then J. Herbert Stone in Oregon as well. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and have us think a little bit about, so that was sort of the facilities, but there's a lot of kind of thinking about design and process when you're designing and planning projects with native vegetation. And one is, how do we want to collect or maintain our seed propagules? So two kind of ways of thinking about it is whether we should hand collect or if we want to farm our seeds. Hand collection is usually going to be with species that are very difficult to propagate in the nursery. Maybe you have a really small project that would make sense for that. The seed is super tiny, you know, like penstemon is like 1 million seeds in a pound or something like that. And maybe the percentage of that plant species is very just incidental in the population, but you think it's really important to have in your restoration. Or vice versa, sometimes plants are really large, like you could think of a lupin seed. One single plant may take up, you know, 1 or 2 square feet, and so you may not also need a lot of seed. And then of course, shrubs and forbs have mostly been collected as hand collection. And then on the other side, another way to mass produce is through farming, which we have also done with native plants. So these are going to be species that are easy to collect, easy to grow. They produce a lot of seed, and they maybe have also a broad ecological amplitude because we tend to use those for like roadside restoration and different kinds of like large scale application. And a lot of those species we call workhorse species. And so workhorse species, these are kind of a handful of like sort of the generally known workhorse species. And of course, a lot of them are grasses. Blue-eyed rye, blue bunch wheatgrass, mountain brome, Sandberg's bluegrass, Great Basin wild rye, Ida's fescue, squirreltail, prairie Junegrass, Sepa, slender hairgrass, and then some forbs that are fairly easy to collect, and they produce a lot of seed. And especially because we've been moving more towards adding pollinator mixes in our roadside grasses mixes. Another amazing resource, you know, I talk a lot about all the different Forest Service facilities, but there's actually, we're so lucky in the Pacific Northwest, we really have a lot of great native plant growers. And this is actually something that was created by Benson Farms, and he's one of our main native plant grass farmers for us that's commercial. And he put together this little sheet for us when we started to think about how we're going to use forbs and how we're really going to increase our use of them over the landscape. And we were able to get him to create this graph that shows which species are best as just hand sowing, which species are better if we use them in containers. How long is it feasible? How long is it going to take us to collect the seed? You know, we need, for instance, Kilea millefolium, we need 3 to 4, let's see, that's ounces. Oh no, sorry, that's per acre, 0.1 acres to plant. So that might be pounds. Anyhow, you can kind of get an idea of how long it's going to take if you're going to put them in production. And then choose, well, maybe these ones only really are best planted in tubes, so maybe you just hand collect them versus put them into a farming setting. So all of these go into the planning and certainly have in my planning. So how about restoration design? You know, I will talk about mycorrhizae here in a little bit. When you're thinking about restoration design, I feel like, for other restoration practitioners on this webinar, I'm sure you have people asking you, what should I do? I want to put native plants here and I want to do it. I want to design this in this way. And sometimes people are like, what should I do in my backyard? I'm probably the worst person to ask because I want everyone's backyard to look like this. For me, of course, on National Forest land, our goal is to maintain our native plant populations, really restore and thinking about pollinators. And, we're interested in the whole ecosystem. But using native plants is messy. Sometimes you can't control how things are going to work for you. And, I think one big question you have to ask yourself is, what is your desired future condition? So this is my desired future condition. So this is what I'm always working towards. And that's why, we in the Forest Service are really trying to use the best genetic material. And you're also going to be more successful if your plants are adapted for that area. Then you don't have to fight with the site as much. So what is your desired future condition? What is the function? And how much can you invest in it? Not just financially, but how much time are you going to invest in this restoration? I think these are all really important considerations in your restoration. What are the trade-offs of doing nothing? Is nature just going to figure it out on our own? Sometimes in some restoration projects, we've learned, especially when we're in riparian areas and you don't have a whole bunch of reed canary grass, sometimes doing nothing is the best. We've also learned that, and sometimes in post-fire restoration, that nature actually has a lot of its own restoration capabilities in the seed zone. But in other cases where you're starting with a blank slate, you really do have to consider how much you want to put in, how much investment you're going to put in before and after, your pre and post. And so we come back to function, ecological suitability, maintenance. So these are all questions you have to ask yourself. Like when I talk to people like, oh, you want to be able to walk on it. Okay, barefoot. So maybe you want to think more about a lawn, although I definitely love the idea of something that you don't really need water. But again, you have to think about function. And then also think about, is it the right plant for the right place? I've seen a lot of projects where there just seems to be a mix of plants that just seem to go on them, but they aren't necessarily appropriate for that site. So, spend a little time thinking about what is supposed to be there. So I'm going to share with you now, which most of you know that I'm going here, is the project that we've been really involved in on I-90, working with Department of Transportation. This is a video that was put out about the project and kind of about the collaboration. It's just really been a fascinating and amazing project. So if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. It was great because it was just a whole lot of people coming together trying to find a common ground for a bigger project. There was so much collaboration here, and it started with wildlife. So let me begin with that story. So here is some of the work that was done by some of our the Wenatchee Forestry Research Lab, Peter Singleton, Bill Gaines, and John Limcool. They've been looking at large roving carnivore connectivity in the state for quite a while. And when you map and model it across the state, some things really jump out at you that you can see. We have these kind of northern, really nice northern habitat in the state. And then right here along I-90, there's the I-90 corridor, we have a couple pinch points right here where the population, you could see that over time, you could see that this population down in the southern part of Washington could become disconnected from the northern part. And so there's just some real thought to how we maintain north-south connectivity for wildlife. And around the same time, Department of Transportation was kind of recognizing that the I-90 corridor had some maintenance needs. You know, there's a lot of east-west transportation needs, you know, agriculture and all kinds of things needing to make their way to the coast. And at Snoqualmie Pass, there are actually a lot of really tight curves. And so you would watch the traffic would tend to get backed up right in that area. And then also in the wintertime, we had some snow issues. So we had kind of a human connectivity issue along I-90. And so there was some talk of increasing the size of I-90. And so that really alarmed a lot of the ecologists in the area, like, oh my gosh, like we just identified this as a major barrier, a potential barrier for our connectivity of our large roving carnivores. And we don't know what kind of implication that's going to have on all kinds of species. And then also during the, you know, the development of I-90, we did all kinds of funny things, like, you know, these kind of riparian holes in the ground, and we called this, you know, a river. And this is basically the headwaters of the upper Yakima. So the water that goes down and feeds all the wineries down there in Yakima all starts up here in this. And, you know, thinking about climate change, we realize that we need to be thinking a little bit more about how we store water. So that's a big thought up in these headwaters of these watersheds. So we've got some ecological connectivity, hydrologic, wetland, and human connectivity issues here. I can't get my slides to advance, sorry. Seem to be frozen. Oh. Okay, there we go, sorry. So a whole lot of great minds came together to think about this problem, from fisheries to water, to, you know, local conservation organizations, and really came together, I think, to make a just amazing project, and that's the I-90 Snoqualmie Pass East project. So this is a 15-mile restoration. You guys are probably really familiar with it, but today I'm just kind of giving you a little glimpse of what some of this work was like from the plant perspective. So it starts pretty much up here, up at Snoqualmie Pass, just past the ski area. And then it drops all the way down. Here's a major barrier to wildlife, the reservoir itself. So some of the big structures kind of were started here in the beginning, where there's the western portion, where there's a major bottleneck, and all the way down to the very end where you finally get to the wildlife overcrossing. And so the project has only really made it to the first 5 miles, but there will be wildlife undercrossings and overcrossings all along this corridor, all the way to Easton into the future. This project is planned to go until 2023, and it pretty much started in about 2004. So here is this last summer, the completion of the first wildlife overcrossing in Washington State. And, oh dear, sorry, I don't know what happened here. My computer thinks there's too much going on, I guess. Excuse me. Having some technical difficulty. Oh, let me go back a slide. But yeah, so we're super excited to have the first wildlife overcrossing, but one big thing is missing. There's no vegetation on it. So actually this fall is when we finally plant it. Yeah, so all of these wildlife overcrossings all occur on Forest Service land. And so they were all subjected to our native plant policy. And the whole team of vegetation specialists came together. We had some horticulturists that specialize in native plants, and myself and Cle Evans, another botanist that I work with. We're kind of formulating the local native plant experts, a landscape architect, some different specialists in the region. We had some geneticists helping out, and of course the local Department of Transportation, environmental managers, a whole team of people actually really to think about, you know, how tall do the plants need to be, you know, thinking about visuals and safety and environmental regulations and consideration. So it really took all these different people to come together. And as most big complicated projects need is a giant Excel spreadsheet. So I'm going to share with you some of how we organized our data. This is something we created called the milestone. And milestone really it's just a super important document that we use to continue to come back to look at our timeline, to look at who's supposed to be doing what are we supposed to be doing, what have we done. So it's a great way to see your successes and sort of where you need to go. Like I said, this project started in 2004 and it's going to go to 2035. So there's a lot of moving parts, contracts, money, moving back and forth, and different people coming in and out. And just planning seed collection, when plants are needing to go to or seeds need to go to the nurseries. It's just a closer look. You know, it's just kind of documenting what needs to occur, you know, different timing, different contracts, different people, the different species we've produced. And then to help supplement that is really a deeper look at each of the species. So early on, after we did a lot of our reference visits to the sites, we knew what species were out there. We started thinking about what we wanted to grow out. We began digging into the plant propagation protocols and really finding out, like, how many seeds are there per pound? How can we plant this many plants on the ground? How much seed are we going to need to collect to be prepared for this project? Are seeds or cuttings better? So we just have this giant, we call it the monster master, and it's massive, all the different plant species we looked at and considered. And then also helped us create a timeline of when we wanted to get out and collect all of our plants. So you can see just a little closer, it's just by species and just a way for us to track our collections. So as we're out looking at our reference sites and just getting out in the fields, we took that time to really document all of the species that we want to collect, mapping, GPSing each of the sites, documenting phenology, looking at when do they actually go to seed set, when is the seed setting, and it's really good for good to collect and provide to the nurseries. A whole lot of phenology mapping data happened behind the scenes in the beginning. So I talked a little bit about genetics and how the Forest Service views maintaining genetic integrity. And in doing that, some of the ways that we do that is through our methodologies and really thinking about how you collect your plant material. So you have a choice of using seeds or plant propagules, you know, if you're collecting cuttings. And cuttings are great, they're easy. You know, there's some timing restrictions. Of course, you want to cut things when they're sort of going dormant or just before they're coming out of dormancy. But then you're not really maximizing your genetic diversity. Your best genetic diversity is going to be in seeds. So we, number one, always go to seed, but sometimes it's just not possible, or the seed is not as viable. You have a lot of competing insects and things like that. We also try to collect from, these are some guidelines that have come out from our genetics departments at the Forest Service. So we like to have 5 population, 50 parents, collecting also at multiple time periods. You know, plants produce seed sometimes early. They begin producing seed, and then they have a core time that will really pump out a lot of seed, and then maybe they're late seed producers. Or something like lupin, which is indeterminate and it's always dropping seed. And so, you know, there's a lot of different, timing is really important in genetics as well. So we want to make sure we capture all that by going out and collecting multiple time periods. And then species, of course, have different timings, like I showed you in our spreadsheet before. Trying to collect equal amounts of the population, so also thinking about population dominance is something we've considered. And then something that we've learned over time is, you know, I think about those beautiful pristine areas, but maybe those aren't necessarily the best place to collect our seed, because those ones are really sort of loving special habitats. And we sometimes really want something that's going to be a good defender against invasive plants. And especially in this I-90 project, we had to take considerations like, are these plants going to survive next to the highway, not being under trees for, you know, at least 7 years, and they might have a pound of sand thrown on them over the winter. So maybe a plant who's living in a disturbed site and seems to be fairly competitive against invasives choice. So here's just kind of a look at our species list. This is our species list has sort of evolved through the years of the project, but this is generally what we are growing. A lot of these species are species that are common to the area. They're maybe, again, some of our workhorse species like I discussed. There's even kind of workhorse shrubs. And we really wanted to pick species that we thought had a broad ecological amplitude. They fill some different successional stages that you find in a forest. And then ones that are going to be a little bit more tolerant of exposure in the sunshine. And we have a myriad of trees to shrubs, riparian species, aquatic species, rock-loving species, because we have all those habitats within I-90. Experimented with different pot sizes. Pot sizes also were important depending on the species. Like some have a really broad root system and they want a wider pot. But in general, we really like these tall pots because they have a tall, long root base. And so we know those plants are getting closer to the water. So here's kind of an overview of sort of our numbers. So we've already planted about 100,000 plants. About 36 acres of restoration has been completed already. And we've put down about 2,000 pounds of seed, 17 shrub species, 3 ferns, 2 trees, 5 grasses, and 3 forbs. And so for the wildlife overcrossing, we added some shrubs. There actually has been some Central Washington University projects that have occurred on I-90 where they're looking at different wildlife that are using small mammals and lizards and aquatics. And so we're using some of their information to make sure we're adding in plants that are being utilized by animals like pikas, their pica piles and things like that. So we've added some more trees, added a few more ferns and shrubs, and of course more forbs. Always want more forbs. So this is kind of how we've utilized our nurseries. So some of the plant material, we've used, we collect willow and cottonwood seed, and we have it actually grown out at some of our Forest Service nurseries in stooling beds. So you give them plant material and they grow it up in basically hedgerows, and then you can obtain these 4-foot stakes very easily. So we ordered 35,000 stakes, and so they were able to send them to us in 50 bundles of 50 for planting. We have nursery in Coeur d'Alene that we grew a lot of different plants, and you can see the Symphoriocarpus hesperius cutting had to be in a bigger pot because the root system is just more broad. And then in the right, Derby Canyon Natives in Peshastin has done hundreds of thousands of our plants, and this actual greenhouse is completely full of I-90 plants, and he's just done a wonderful job with a lot of that vegetation. We've had some experimental things occurring where we decided to grow Equisetum arvense, and no nursery wanted to grow it because they all said they've been trying to get rid of it out of their nursery for about, their whole time in production. But we were able to talk a Forest Service nursery into growing it for us. And they just chop off all the sporophytes, and we used it in the riparian restoration. And then ferns, kind of a challenge, because we really want to use the local genetics, and so that requires growing out spores. And really, in the Pacific Northwest, there isn't really any large production fern growers. There is some small ones, in Sky Comish, but they weren't interested when we asked if they could grow us 10,000 sword fern. And so we actually have a sporophyte producer. So we collect all the spores and we send them to a producer in Texas. And then he sends them to Nursery in Paulsbo, Sunquist Nurseries, which is an amazing finisher. And so he finishes all of our ferns for us. So we kind of had to figure out some of these processes of some plants that we were interested in. So here's a look at some of the projects. So like I was showing you, at the very west end of the project here is the Gold Creek Bridge. You can see there is a wetland here, and there's a wetland over here, and how easy the deer and wildlife can just walk right over. So there was a process where they actually looked along the I-90 corridor where there are major roadkills. And so we really positioned a lot of these bridges at those locations, because that was another goal that we also wanted to achieve, is alleviate some of the hazards along the highway. It's a pretty long stretch of a wetland. You can see this is the only location right here is where water could currently pass through a little creek. So Gold Creek Bridge, through the vision of many, has become this. Today, this is a 600-foot bridge. This will be completely inundated with water, which is another challenge that I will talk about. But yeah, this is great. You know, we have really good connectivity, hydrologic, wildlife. There's a lot of different structures that are underneath it, like some standing poles and some logs that were anchored and some rock piles for pikas and lizards, just providing really connectivity and habitat for not just wildlife. Really, this project was trying to provide connectivity for all high mobility and low mobility species, soil, plants, you know, all of these were taken in consideration, which is just so unique. And it has been done not without challenges. We had to use some really highly specialized equipment. So this is underneath that wildlife, or that Gold Creek Bridge. Underneath is full of rocks from the very early days of I-90 construction. And so in order to plant willows in this, we had to use some special tools. This is called a stinger. And so they're basically planting right in rock. There is some soil down there as well. Another really interesting tool we got to use was a spider. It's kind of this kind of excavator that can walk gingerly over a really steep slope. So we use this to decompact really steep slopes and move logs and things like that. Here you can see, this is that little opening I was showing you where the creek was before. And this is not even in its extremes, but you can see that here in November, there's just, you know, a bit of a stream. All the vegetation is high and dry, looking like a normal stream. And then, you know, by February, the whole thing is flooded, and it actually stays flooded until July. So in order to revegetate after all of this was excavated, we put in, like I said, 35,000 willow stakes, 4-foot stakes so that they wouldn't float away. And we quickly realized that the vegetation, even in this area, we tested lots of different vegetation. We had issues of things floating away or species that just couldn't survive. And so this is where local genetics really comes into play. So we collected all willows and cottonwoods really basically from the reservoir in that area. And our nurseries were so surprised how small the growth rings were on those willows. And so I think these willows are just really have actually adapted to this environment of being able to only grow between basically August and October. And then again, they're flooded underwater. So a challenge, but using native vegetation, it was really be able to support that challenge. Here again, here's another shot underneath that wildlife undercrossing. So we planted little ravines, put different kinds of wildlife structures in there. And then just, you can see this picture down here is really just west of that wetland. And here we have a high and dry undercrossing so that year-long animals can pass through there and be on the northern part of the northwestern part of the shore. Here's that picture I showed you earlier, Resort Creek, which was just a little trickle. And it was just amazing what we've been able to do with some of these underpasses. This is what it looks like now. Just an actual stream, an actual area where you can see wildlife will be able to use this. And, you know, as soon as we put in plants in that location, I will feel like we have finally hit restoration. You know, you can see this is one of the sites adjacent to there where we've added wood, added forbs and shrubs and grasses. And, you know, it's really starting to look like a natural restoration. Here's another site just south of that area, a wetland that had been used to store rock in up Gold Creek, adjacent to I-90. We had to excavate about 3 feet of gravel. It's full of weeds, and add some wood structures, did some recontouring, just to kind of find some of the natural wetland features that were in there, get down to some wetland soils, add vegetation, add some logs. And here it is. Actually, this picture is about 2 years ago. Now the willows are kind of overhead of this person. It's just super productive and doing such a great job. Gold Creek Stockpile. And you were kind of looking at the Gold Creek Valley there. Here's another one, Stampede Stockpile. Again, another stockpile site. I don't know, we had to excavate at least like 10 feet down. So much gravel and old roadside debris. Recontouring, brought in mulch that was actually made from wood from the project. Brought in some of our willows that we had grown out, some beautiful deer fern by Sunquist, and brought in some compost, and added some of our lovely native plants, you know, adding different elevations in these wetlands and all of the different woody debris. They've just really, these places have taken, you know, a life of their own. So this is kind of bare, and this is actually just about 3 years ago, but still been pretty good. Townsend Creek is just a beautiful wetland now. It was just this little tiny culvert. There actually was an old existing I-90 Sunset Highway that ran over top of it. So all of this was removed. The creek was put into a natural channel again, and an undercrossing was created, and this whole wetland was restored. The old highway was removed. We went down to wetland soils, brought in a whole bunch of woody debris, added some plants, and you can see within a year, it just began to, once we fixed the hydrology, even though we did do we did planting, this is one of those that once you fix the hydrology, then native revegetation just happened on its own. And a lot of, there was a local wetland complex nearby, and those all just started coming in. And it was super exciting because the very year after the project was completed up there, vegetation was in, we had bull trout, which is a listed fish, kind of a really unique population for this area, came right up into this area, into this creek, which had not been documented before. So that was super exciting. We felt like that was a big success for everyone. And so here's the wildlife overcrossing this last winter, and you know, kind of awaits the planting this fall. So it, you know, none of these sites, I will say, I didn't really chat about this at all during my talk, but these sites are definitely not perfect by any means. You know, they do exist next to the highway, and so they have had their challenges of invasive plants. That's a whole story in itself. But you know, site prep, we worked a lot with the engineers and the different environmental managers, and really were thoughtful about our site prep, having good mulch and soil, using the right native materials. You know, they helped invest in a lot of supporting this project. We've had about 90% survival rate of all of the native plants in this project so far. Grasses have been a little bit, you know, there's some things to really consider about grass suitability in some of the places. Some of them are pretty rocky, but in terms of all of the plants that we've put in, they've all been really successful. So we're really excited to get the overpass planted this fall. That'll be a whole new experiment. And one of the really interesting experiments we're working with Central Washington University is we're talking about how to add in native mycorrhizae into these sites. So we're going to be experimenting with taking native soil cores from the forest, adjacent forest, and actually plugging those soil plugs into the soil. And we have a grad student at Central, and they are going to be looking at they've been looking at the mycorrhizae at the nurseries. They looked at fungi in general in the soils that are in the overcrossing that have not had any amendments to them except for maybe compost and mulch. And then they're also, we're going to have a secondary grad student come in after we plant and put in the soil plugs to look and see if we're able to recolonize with some of these mycorrhizae. So that's kind of exciting and something new and interesting. So, you know, we're super excited to have this wildlife overcrossing and, you know, all the things that we can study with it. It's pretty funny because here's a deer just walking straight through the construction site even before there's vegetation. So I think it's already a success, if you ask me. But with that, that's about all I have to share with you. If you have any questions, go ahead and shoot them in the webinar chat. Let's see, I'm going to go back to my chat and see.
Hey, Helen, this is Emily.
Yeah.
We have received a couple of questions that I think you might be able to address.
Okay.
Let's see. We just received one from Erica, who would like to know if there's been any research done about what plants animals prefer to graze, nest, or feel safe in on the over and under crossings on your project.
That's a good question. I haven't been given any of that information, and that might be a better one for a wildlife biologist. But, you know, like I said, we've worked a little bit with the small mammal people, and the grad student had provided her list of what species picas preferred in their pica pile. So we're definitely trying to address that. We know that there are some studies on bears, and bears being important to the movement and propagation of populations of huckleberries. So we are actually putting some huckleberries on the wildlife overcrossing as well. I can tell you that we do have problems in some of the sites where the deer do love to browse, and so far they haven't actually killed any of our plants. We don't fence or we don't cage any of our vegetation because we're planting so heavy in this project. You know, a lot of what our philosophies in restoration is plant with a lot of diversity and plant heavy. We're planting like 3-foot spacing, which is very tight. And we also feel okay with some of the plant death that's going to happen. You know, we're hoping that we plant enough diversity and we plant the right species that we can kind of let nature figure out what is suitable for this site. Because I don't know everything. You know, this is kind of our best guess, and we're really trying to just use the right materials and plant in a way that we can leave it so that nature can continue on its restoration journey.
Thanks, Helen. Another question that came in is from Gary, and he was hoping that you could touch on how climate change might impact success, germination, timing, pollination in regards to the restoration project.
Yeah, you know, there's always lots of discussion, and even in our own native plant policies, we do have some flexibility in the native plant policy to consider moving slightly drier species or taking climate change as a consideration in how we move species. I don't feel like there's clear consensus on that right now, and so we're not doing that kind of mediated plant movement yet. But one thing we do is we try to select a handful of plants that we know are already in drier sites. So for instance, you saw we had serviceberry and ocean spray. Those are species that are present in the seed zone. They're not, some of them may not, actually serviceberry is present, but it's not as prevalent. But we opted to use it because it is a drier species. And so we try to take that consideration. You know, one thing that we have seen actually in just my short life with this project is insects have taken a huge toll on sometimes some years the seed production. And so that's kind of been a challenge. I feel like I really don't know, which species are going to be the winners. And so again, that's why we sort of plant heavy and plant lots of different species. But we do know right now that when you look at soil temperatures, they're going down slightly because our snowpack is shrinking. And so that could affect seed germination, because a lot of them are doing these kind of like hot cold, there's a hot cold strata or a freeze thaw stratification that's happening to those native seeds. Some of those that are reliant on that, maybe they won't germinate every year, and so you could see certain species change dominance, I imagine. Yeah, we actually have a little bit of concern with the wildlife overcrossing itself. So we do usually plan used to be 50%, but now a 30% extra planting the following year, because we want to see what is successful. The wildlife overcrossing, because it's kind of hanging out there in space, we're kind of curious about what the temperature. And actually the grad student who's working on our mycorrhizae project, she's already looking at temperature, and she's shown that there is a temperature difference in those soils compared to, forest soils. So we're sort of interested to see which plants are going to be more successful. Yeah, those are very good questions and totally things we should be thinking about.
Excellent, thank you. Linda's wondering what species animal species have you seen already using the under and over crossings?
Oh, wow. Well, they've gotten, well, really recently, actually, they had a weasel species. Everybody was sort of excited because we don't know which one it could be. Could be a fisher, or, could just be a mink, or not quite sure. Deer right away, like you could see. Deer all the time now. I'm there and they're like deer hanging out in the bushes. This year, something new, they put up fences to try to really help funnel the animals to the wildlife overcrossings. They say it usually takes about 4 years for wildlife to really find it, because you need, the deer to find it, and then you'll start to get the carnivores after that. This year we had elk actually going in an undercrossing, which in the past had not been known. We had always thought that undercrossings were something that elk don't like to use. And the overcrossing are really for things like cougars and bears, wolves. But we have had bobcats, lots of small mammals, ducks, a myriad of things. You can go to the I-90 Wildlife Bridges Coalition, Conservation Northwest. They have a whole bunch of cameras, and even WASDOT, they have a bunch of cameras, and you can see some great footage of animals. This winter, it was great. There's a fantastic video of a coyote going up on the wildlife overcrossing and then turning around and sledding down on his back down the wildlife overcrossing. It's so great.
That's great. A couple other questions that are sort of related. Dustin and Erica would like to know, what sort of measures are you taking to sort of funnel the wildlife towards the crossings? Obviously, fencing is going to play a big part, but Erica is wondering if there's particularly desirable plants or food sources that are kind of helping those migrating animals select those corridors.
Yeah, we definitely tried to pick, it was interesting, that was where the landscape architect kind of came into play, because we would discuss, well, we don't want to put this plant there because that's going to be where vehicles might travel, and we don't want animals to be attracted to that. And we picked a lot of plants that have berries. I was just going to go back to my plant list if I can. And we added huckleberries because we thought that was really important. The other thing that happened, even, as the bridge location was selected, many of those locations were selected because of where there were high wildlife kill areas already, so there's already high movement in those spots. They also tried to pick sites that had connected habitat, so we know that animals are already using that, you know, we're kind of using those areas, so they're living in those areas. So like, for instance, we've had this bear that's kind of just hanging around in one spot, but it hasn't been crossing yet. We think maybe it's a matter of time. So those are some considerations, but definitely a bunch of these species have berries, you know, salmonberry, twinberry, well, actually salmonberry, maybe more so. I don't know how much eats twinberry. The roses, the beaked hazelnut, we know wildlife will definitely use, and red flowering currant, red osier dogwood. Yeah, and like I don't think vaccinium seems to be showing up on those lists, but there is also vaccinium, and we have salal. Yeah, so there's a few more things that aren't showing up in this list right now that we've sort of changed. It probably hasn't been the primary consideration. We really tried to look at what is common in the sites, what's common to the area first, and then we also tried to add in those as considerations to boost up our species list.
Great, thank you. We also have another question about Gold Creek. Linda's wondering if the restoration of Gold Creek may bring back its original hydrological characteristics, and she's kind of specifically wondering about the borrow pit.
Okay, so are we talking about the picture that I showed? So there's a Gold Creek wetland, and then there's a Gold Creek pond. Is that, Linda, can you clarify? Are you referring to Gold Creek Pond, or you're referring to
Linda, yeah, maybe if you could get back to us on that, Linda. And in the meantime, Helen, I have some other questions we could get into until Linda has time to respond. Let's see. Ernest was wondering about what the cost of the project is from beginning to end.
Okay, well, I don't know about the bridge itself, but I can tell you the vegetation. We've probably spent, I think at the end of all of the plants themselves and planting and all the planning, things like that, we'll have probably spent at least like 6 million, maybe. You know, this is 15 acres. So far, we've already revegetated 36 acres. Some of that is also funds of, you know, time for the seed collection, and also some of it has been, we've done some of the, in our contracts, we've done some of the earth moving, the moving of logs, giant rocks. So there is some of the big restoration component in there. But I think in terms of just the plant material itself, we've probably, planting and plant material, we've probably spent like 3 million, something like that. So probably like half plant material, half kind of the planning and all the other structural stuff. When all said and done, like we haven't used all that yet. There's still, like I said, there's some planting to be done, and then there's actually a whole nother phase. So we're working towards that.
All right. So Linda got back to us about her question about Gold Creek, and she's referring to Gold Creek Pond.
Okay.
So she's wondering if we'll see a return to original hydrologic condition for Gold Creek Pond.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is, you know, and we've seen it in this project. I would say when you fix the hydrology, the vegetation seems to come along. Like I couldn't come into a site and just vegetate it with wetland vegetation and then say it's going to become a wetland. You know, hydrology is just the key component to getting some of that back. What we have been able to do is alter the landscape and change elevations, and that's been huge, changing elevations. So in a bunch of those wetland sites, we dug down and we got to wetland soil, and you know, we actually started to match where there was wetland soils. And a lot of this area, and you can see it all along the I-90 corridor, I've done tons of plant surveys in the area, it's wetland, forested wetlands, and that's the habitat. And unfortunately, I-90 is like, you know, this giant barrier right between it, and all of the work that happened on I-90 created all of these breaks of a lot of that really important wetland habitat. So right now, there's just a lot of effort to really fix hydrology. And I would say that's one very unique thing on the United Project as well, is that they have done just a tremendous effort to connect hydrologic connectivity. And that in itself is huge. I mean, like you said, you know, like I said, we brought, that fish came back, and that tells you something about what has happened in that site. And you can tell when you go and visit it. It looks like it has, it's like a wetland. It's recovered. It's amazing that there was a highway that went through that before. So I'm hopeful about Bull Creek Pond, but it's going to be a challenge for sure. It's not easy, and they all are. Some of these we've had to be adaptive, and you know, like I said earlier, with restoration, I think the key component is thinking about what it is that is your ultimate goal, and with that ultimate goal comes a question of how much pre and post work are you willing to do. And if you're willing to come back, I think then, you know, you can continue to modify, because not all of these are going to work the first time. We had one site that they had created a stream, a high gradient stream, and then the first November it blew out because it was way more high gradient than anyone could have imagined, because we had these 100-year floods. And we just sort of adapted. You know, we came back in with some plants, and we moved some things, and it can be done as long as you're able to come back and, you know, continue
Great.
to cook the product.
Let's see, Helen, Bill was wondering, what is the soil depth on the overpass, and is it deep enough for the planting of trees?
Yeah, so originally it was designed to have trees on it. The depth was, I can't remember what the depth is right now. I want to say it's like at least 10 feet. But now I'm thinking, I know when they were building the bridge, they were weighting it so it could hold so many trees and so many logs and a certain amount of soil. But at the end, actually, the engineers won and decided they don't want trees on the overcrossing itself. So that picture that I have at the end is, you know, it's just a designed picture. And we probably will only have really small trees on the overpass itself. Like we're thinking maples. I'm sure that some hemlock are going to rein themselves in anyhow, because that's what they do. So we may just see hemlocks on there anyway. But there's recognized, you know, some maintenance to that they probably will not allow trees to be on top.
So is it just, so the reason for the no trees on the overpass, is that just because they're concerned about the structural integrity of the structure, if we have tree roots that might be eating into the concrete, for example?
No, they're mostly concerned that the trees will fall onto the right of way. Like at some point, trees are going to be tall enough that they'll have to fall over. And, you know, some of us have said, well, we'll just go up and top them when, you know, they get to a certain height, and we just couldn't win. But we do plan to plant trees just a little lower down, just not where it's overhanging the actual right of way.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
Helen,
so I think it's weighted for it.
Okay. Erica was wondering if any of the plants that you guys used in the restoration project were specifically with pollinators in mind.
Yeah, so we specifically wanted to plant penstemon, and actually how we've been handling that primarily is we've been trying to collect more forbs and put them into our seed mixes. They're all hand collections, and we're not growing those out in a farm because it's just taking too long, and it's very costly. So penstemon and lupin, of course, Achillea millefolium, and then a lot of the forbs, like any of the Revi sanguineum, some of those shrubs, ceanothus. I think we initially did not use as many forbs in the early projects because there was a thought that roadside herbicide was going to take out some of the forbs in their management. But we've kind of switched gears on that, and we're taking more of a selective herbicide route. Like, they're not broadcast spraying. We're really targeting really noxious invasive weeds. And so we've been adding more and more forbs to our list for the future project. Also, you know, right at the pass itself, you don't have a lot of real like heavy, you know, dry open meadows, but as we move east, we'll have more of that kind of habitat, so that opportunity will be there.
That's great. One more, did the revegetation of the Elwha former reservoirs inform any of this revegetation work?
Ooh, no, I would have loved to know more about what they did. No, it didn't actually. I believe I don't remember when that happened. I think that this project was already going. Our first year of planting was 2015, so we really began collecting in 2009, I believe. That's some of our early seed collection work.
Great. John is wondering how much runoff from the highways and some of the chemicals that they would use on the highways in the winter, how would that affect the areas around them, particularly the wetland areas? And then are there any measures that you're using in the restoration work to try to combat that?
Yeah, and that's been a little bit of a learning process. We have found in certain areas are high levels of magnesium chloride, and we'll have a few dead spots, especially where water, some water will pool after a while. And so that's something that we've kind of had to deal with. Some of those areas we're experimenting with just using various grasses that are a little bit more salt tolerant. There is, and this is kind of on the engineering side, I know that they have like a media strip, which they have an area where it's supposed to basically catch a lot of the runoff. You know, technically the wetlands shouldn't be getting runoff in them. There should be some sort of barrier between those. Some of the roadside areas with the media strip end up becoming wetlands though. And so what you see is just plants that really survive in that environment will grow there.
Excellent. Well, I think all the other comments we have in the chat and the Q&A are just, you know, again, thank you so much, Helen, for being here tonight. Ernest says that you're an eco-star, and Berna says that this has been a fascinating webinar. So just thank you so much for taking the time to do this presentation this evening for all of us. And, you know, we really appreciate you for being here. And Denise, thank you so much for helping us navigate this technology and being super on point with this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for hosting me. And hi to all those great familiar faces in the list.
Thank you so much for being here, Helen. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, no problem. If anyone has any questions, they can always send me an email, and I'll just put my email address back on the page real quick. There it is.
All right. Well, good night, Helen, and thanks to everybody for being here.
Thank you, Helen. It was truly amazing. My second time watching as the presentation at the Botanical Symposium was equally as inspiring. And for all of us that travel this way to get to the places we love, it is wonderful to see that the barriers are coming down. So thank you for your work. It's amazing. All right, folks that are left on the call, we have one last Native Plant Appreciation Month presentation tomorrow night with Sarah Gage presenting a 1-hour glimpse of how to identify native plants. She's a superstar. I hope you're joining us. Also look out for our notices in May announcing more fantastic webinars to come. Thank you for being here with us tonight.
All right, well, that's about everybody, but thanks again, Helen. It was really, really great to have you on tonight, and of course, a really excellent program, so thank you so much. It's really very much appreciated on behalf of the Wenatchee Valley Chapter and the Native Plant Society in general. All right, bye.
Don't go. Oh. Good night, everyone. Thank you.